People say it's always about the story, but really it's always about the emotional impact. The audience doesn't walk away always remembering every single fact about the story and like the sequence of events, but what they walk away with was that feeling that they had when they connected with the story. You know, as colorists, that's what we get to do, is we get to like really make that feeling so much more impactful.
On this episode of the Colorist Podcast, I talk with Ian Vertovec, co-founder and senior colorist at Light Iron. Ian has colored major films The Social Network, The Girl with the Dragon Tattoo, and Ender's Game. And more recently, he has colored the TV shows Baskets for FX and Glow on Netflix. Originally from Chicago, Ian focused on photography, then moved on to digital compositing. He later co-founded two post facilities in Los Angeles, Plaster City, then Light Iron. Out of necessity, he moved on to color at his company. He found his combination of photography and compositing matched perfectly for a career as a colorist. In this podcast, we talk about coloring David Fincher films and working with extremely dark images, the challenges of working on VFX-heavy projects, making HDR look both cinematic and realistic, and the advantages of working on high-end systems like Quantel Pablo. And now, here's Ian Vertovec. Well, thanks, Ian, for coming on to the podcast.
Oh, awesome. Thanks for having me.
So I understand you have a background in photography and visual effects. So how did you get started in this line of work?
I went to school originally for still photography. So, you know, a lot of darkroom film processing and developing type stuff. But I kind of wound up in the visual effects world, like kind of like an After Effects type of freelancer. And so I did that for several years. I guess I didn't even really know colorist was a job at the time. And then I just kind of fell into color correcting. I started a company like 2003 called Plaster City, and we didn't have a colorist. So I was like, oh, I can do it. I kind of know photography, and it evolved from there and kind of expanded from there and just kind of never stopped. You know, really loved it.
I'm sure a lot of the darkroom techniques really kind of served you as a colorist too.
Yeah, I mean, it's like I didn't even really realize, you know, when I was doing still photo stuff, I was, of course, spending most of my time in the darkroom, kind of playing around with the enlarger and the chemicals and what would happen if I exposed it for longer and then kept it in the developer for shorter and then exposed it for shorter and kept it in the developer for longer, and kind of just kept going back and forth and doing that stuff. And I didn't really go out and shoot that much. So it kind of worked out really well that that's basically all a colorist does.
Yeah. So your visual effects background too, you know, there's a lot of crossover between what a colorist does and these days what they do in visual effects. Did that also seem to help you?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it separated me out from a lot of the people that had more, because I didn't have like a real telecine assistant background. I never really operated any of those kind of telecine machines. So I was much more confident with the digital tools and the compositing. And so in one ways it was a little bit of a disadvantage because I didn't know quite as much about the different film stocks and the different things, but I knew more about the other aspect of it. Like I was much more comfortable in the early days doing a sky replacement or painting out something on the ground, and there was many, many times in the early days where I was just like, oh, I'll just go and do this in After Effects real quick. And I would just take the shot, blow it up in After Effects, track, paint out the paint on the, you know, whatever was on the ground or whatever. And, you know, 2005, 2006, that was like a big deal. You know, nowadays it's not that big of a deal. But back then it was like, oh my gosh, you fixed that. You saved us so much money and you're great. And so that helped. Nowadays it's kind of expected. It's like, paint this out, or oh, do this, or oh. So it's not so novel anymore. But yeah, in the early days it was really, really good for me.
Yeah, and I'm sure that helped you guys get clients too, because being more nimble in the company, I'm sure that they were like, oh, well, we could just go to one place for all of this stuff.
Yeah, well, we were a smaller company too. So it was one of those things where it's just like everyone has to do more. You know, when you're in a smaller company, you're kind of expected to do more things. So, you know, also knowing the different programs, I was able to do some editing real quick. And it wasn't like there was a separate smoke where, you know, oh, I don't do that, some other guy does that. And, you know, I was doing more of the process altogether. And that's really important when you're starting out because you have less people. When you're on the bigger shows, they don't want you wasting time changing the duration of a dissolve or something. They want you to be coloring. You know, they're paying you to be coloring, and, you know, painting out a tape mark on the ground is great, but there's like 30 guys that can do that. where you're the only colorist. So now it's like, no, you have to be coloring. If you can do it real quick, fine. But if it's going to take you more than 10 minutes, then they're wasting their money.
Right. So yeah, you've worked on some really great films, Social Network, Gone Girl, Girl with a Dragon Tattoo. One thing that they all share is that there's a lot of extremely dark scenes in them. David Fincher referred to this as a dark clarity. What's the key to making images work when you're working with a scene that's so dense and dark?
Well, David has he has a really interesting process. For any given project, he'll just say, okay, the blacks on every shot, no matter what, I want the blacks at 4% or something, like something for a specific job. And he's like, I want the highlights at this, and I want the skin tones at this. And he kind of lays it all out. It might be different if it's Social Network or Gone Girl, but he'll establish a level for the shadows and for the speculars and for a kind of a diffuse white. And then he's like, every shot has to be that. It's this limitation that I know, okay, every shot, the blacks have to be at exactly this level and exactly this and exactly this before I even show it to him. I make sure, okay, everything is basically how he wants it laid out. And then it's just kind of further revisions from there. So it's like having those kind of rules, because in color, there's really no rules really. It's just kind of whatever you as a group decide looks good. But because he kind of imposed those rules, it kind of forced a certain consistency on the whole process. We had a very consistent baseline going in, and then we just kind of evolved from there. It kind of evolved. And then also nothing's a big note. It's always a little bit darker on this guy or a little bit more on this. And it's not any big sweeping note, the culmination of hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of teeny little notes.
Right. It's as you're sculpting, you're kind of just adding and subtracting little things here and there.
Yeah. And also something that kind of I had to learn to do was, because it was very intense and we were working for a long time, if I didn't kind of mentally concatenate my layers, I would have ended up with 100 layers. I had to try to do as much as possible on as few nodes as I could figure out how to do it. So it really forced me to use as few layers as possible. And I feel like that makes things feel much more natural. You know what I mean? Instead of this really crazy look, the image looks manipulated. If you do as much as you can with as little as possible and as evasive as possible, it ends up looking more like an image from another world rather than just a manipulated looking image.
Yeah, I totally see that too. So moving on to something that is completely another project that you work on that's almost completely artificial is Ender's Game, right? Where there's a ton of visual effects and a ton of green screen composites. So in contrast, how do you work on something like that where everything is kind of artificial?
Yeah, Ender's Game was interesting because on those big visual effects movies where you have whole scenes that are just CGI scenes, basically, of spaceships, it becomes a lot more about the workflow, obviously, out of necessity. It's a little less creative. It's if you're doing an indie, like a Sundance type indie, you can do kind of real bananas type things, in the DI, and what does this look like? What does this look like? And you push it really far and have fun with the director and the cinematographer. On something like that, you really can't. Your hands are a little bit more tied, because if they deliver a bunch of CGI shots of spaceships or whatever, or of aliens and things, and then you do a crazy cross-process look or skip bleach look, the compositors you're gonna be breaking their hearts, because they've spent so long trying to make the details exactly right or exactly this. And I remember on Ender's Game specifically, the human spaceships had little blue lights and the alien spaceships had little red lights. And that kind of helped you separate out exactly what was happening during the space battles. And as soon as I desaturated it a little too much or kind of did a little warm cool, you start to lose the ability to kind of tell what's going on, because it's this kind of big, complicated scene. So it's a little bit more about workflow, but it can be collaborative too, because I remember on that film, there was this kind of this queen alien at the end. And, I went to the visual effects supervisor and I was like, okay, what would happen if I really kind of pulled the color out of the kind of the alien skin and kind of made her bluer and cooler? And so we tried it, and it kind of separated. The skin of the alien was kind of translucent a little bit. So there's things happening kind of underneath, and they had done a lot in the 3D. And when I kind of sucked some of the color out, you kind of started to see the layers underneath a little bit more. And it was something like no one had really seen before. And so it can get really collaborative and interesting. You're a little bit more restrained, you know what I mean? And then at the same time, like another film I did, The Circle with Maddie LaBoutique, we had these scenes where it was like long scenes that were basically just like Tom Hanks in front of a green screen. And he was doing like the keynote address, like the Steve Jobs kind of keynote address type of thing. And we had no idea what the backgrounds would be because we were just grading the green screens. And so like there was some temps that we saw and we're like, okay, well, there's some text behind them and this and whatever. So we graded it one way. We graded kind of the whole film one way. And then when we actually got the visual effects, like a couple weeks later, they were totally different than the temp. We kind of graded it like thinking that there would be like a cooler background, but then it ended up being like a very warm background. And all of a sudden, his skin tone was getting a little bit more lost in the whole scene. And it kind of like, we really had to kind of scramble a little bit to kind of find a solution that would pull him out a little bit more and separate him. So it can be a little bit more challenging, I think. If you have visual effects and you don't know what you're doing, it's harder because we're starting the DI earlier. We're starting the DI these days when a lot of shots aren't complete, and they're rolling in during the process. Communication sometimes is I mean, like it's not like we had bad communication, but it's like we just didn't know what we were going to get when we got it. And then we kind of had to change, once we kind of saw what it would be.
So in these circumstances, do you ever work in a project with ACES or with any of the other options like True Light or any other color managed workflows?
Yeah, no, I've done a couple of ACES shows. It was pretty much kind of on the cinematographer's request. And it's great. One of the things I have, those like color managed workflows is, they're really great, but sometimes, I want to use the right tool for the job. And sometimes with a color managed workflow, if the kind of the rendering transform isn't the look that you're going for, then you kind of naturally kind of have to fight against it a little bit. So you have to almost kind of reverse engineer your look to get to your look. Sometimes you talk with a DP and they have a certain reference, a certain film reference or any sort of visual reference. And then you can almost kind of create your own rendering transform or, curve, exactly what to do. But if you had to kind of work against like kind of an established orthodox rendering, you're kind of just fighting it a little bit. You know what I mean?
Yeah. I've heard about a lot of resistance to ACES, the way that it's actually done, a lot of the display rendering transforms, as you had said. And you can tell just because in each revision, it's changed pretty dramatically. So there's not one set way to do it. Not only that, but then you add in Resolve Color Management or True Light or any of those. It still feels like everybody's trying to figure out the best possible way to do this.
Yeah, I got burned just a little bit in the very, very early days before kind of the official 1.0 when like the inverses weren't quite there yet because you're like, okay, we're going to do this ACES. Great. And then like you get stock footage or a company credit logo in Rec 709. And it's like, okay, well, I have to inverse it to a really big color space just to go back to a reasonably small color space. And so that's like the flexibility thing where it's like, it'd be nice to, use ACES on the shots or whatever, whether it's ACES or it's True Light or it's Resolve, use that color management workflow on the shots that need it. But on the shots that don't need it so much, just go directly, take your stock footage directly from Rec 709 to P3 without having to inverse it way out to like some sort of huge camera color space. That's what they are. They're camera color spaces. They're huge. Why do it if that shot doesn't need it?
So speaking of larger, wider color spaces, you had recently done the show Glow for Netflix, which was like a 80s retro kind of vibe to it. And it was all done in HDR. And, the temptation to make images overly bright with HDR is very high. One thing that stuck with me too when I was reading about this was your goal was to make this both cinematic and realistic. What was your experience working with HDR?
I love it. I think it's really great. We were pretty skeptical at first. The Christian Springer was the cinematographer for season 1 of Glow. And I had done a bunch of versions of other features in HDR. So, coloring it theatrically. And then once all the creative work was done on the theatrical, there was like an HDR deliverable. So then I'd take it in and put it up and swap the LUT and just kind of match what we originally did. And that's pretty easy. You can get to your look pretty easy because you have the guide that, like you said, the temptation's not quite there to make it overly bright because you've already done it at 100 nits or whatever. So
yeah, I mean, I really like the look of that show too. It was cool because it was like using a new technology, but in a retro-y kind of way.
Oh, yeah.
You know, a lot of the stuff that we do in general is really motivated by what we get. It's always kind of like we get a canvas that's half done and we can only use what's actually in it to improve on, right?
Yeah, yeah. It's exactly what you said. The HDR is really a bigger, better canvas. The analogy I use is like it's a larger playground. And just because it's a larger playground doesn't mean you have to run from one corner of the playground to the other. And,
yeah.
You know, you can play in this corner for a little bit, and then you can move over to another area when you get bored of that first corner, and then play over there for a little bit and then move around. So it's like you have more space to move around. That doesn't force you to like be constantly running back and forth. The cameras shoot so many stops these days that we're throwing away so much dynamic range in our roll-off when we just master for conventional 709 or DCI P3. So HDR is actually delivering more of the scene's original dynamic range to the consumer. So it really can be a cinematographer's best friend once everyone has a little bit more experience with it and is a little more comfortable with it. It's not going to, I don't really think it's going to force everything to be brighter. You know, that's the first joke was like, after so many years of color correcting, I've never had a cinematographer come up and be like, okay, now if only we can make everything twice as bright.
Yeah.
So you don't have to do that. You can. I mean, what's great, I mean, there's a few shots in Glow where it's like night and they're just kind of like driving around at night, and those like street lights and things that are just kind of coming in around the periphery. You know, it's like the faces look the same. They look normal. They look nice and beautiful. But then you get these kind of like bright, colorful things coming from the edge of frame, and they're just in the periphery of your vision, and it just feels more real. It feels more interesting, and it's more like what it would really be like to kind of be sitting in a car at night talking to somebody, but then have these like headlights kind of coming in from the outside of the car. So it's interesting.
It's funny too, because we measure everything like in nits to see how bright a monitor can get. But what a lot of people I think miss is the ability to dig into all those shadows too and see all the detail down there.
Yeah. Well, and also sometimes you can really do, if you have like a day scene and then you go into a night scene, you can make it really feel, because our eyes haven't quite adapted yet to the darker level. It's interesting what you can do kind of temporarily over time, you know, because you can grade like a scene a little bit, you know, without it being contrasted. You can just take the whole index up, like a half a stop or something. And so you can kind of make a scene look nice because, you know, your eyes, your irises will kind of like adjust to it being brighter. And then on a cut, you can go to a scene and make it just feel really dark. And it's like you haven't quite adjusted to the darkness yet. And you can just kind of play with that natural thing that our brains do, where we kind of adjust to the bright, and then the bright feels normal, and then you adjust to the dark, and then dark feels normal. You can really create more interesting contrasts because, you know, with regular, even in P3, you know, it's the same dynamic range effectively. So a night scene is only just a little bit richer than it. Like the night scene is not really any darker than a day scene. It's just more contrasty and deeper shadows and, you know, maybe a little bit darker, but not really that much darker. But in HDR, you can really create some interesting rhythms through the whole show.
Was this your first foray into TV from cinema, or had you done TV before this?
I did with Christian, the same DP, I did the season 1 of Baskets. We'd worked together on that show, and then we did a feature called Birds Be Bear. And then Glow was for Netflix, so of course they wanted Dolby Vision HDR. And because it's Dolby Vision, they wanted the HDR to be the primary color correction. Everything else had kind of just been like the HDR10, where it's just a version that you kind of also do. Yeah, Glow was the first. HDR is the main creative grade. And then since then, I've done another show for Netflix called Everything Sucks, which comes out in a couple months, I think, a month or two.
So did you find that working on TV was significantly different than working in cinema?
Well, yeah, I mean, it's a lot faster. I got like a day per episode, you know, essentially. Kind of goes back to the less is more thing where it's just like you have to, you just have to get as much done as you possibly can with kind of one layer and then move on, and one layer, move on, and really only get into the power windows and rotoscoping if it's kind of absolutely essential. So if you can kind of like get the skin tone looking right and get the scene matching and get the walls looking neutral, and if you can kind of accomplish everything just on one layer, then you're much better off. So it does force a little bit more of a time crunch on it, but it's not so different from the way I work normally, because when I do a feature, I work very quickly through the whole thing, and I try to do like rough draft of the whole thing and then kind of a finer draft and a finer draft and a finer draft. I don't really finish a scene and then move on to the next scene. I kind of rough it in and then keep moving forward, rough it in and keep moving forward. And I think that helps a lot of times the filmmaker too, because they don't get into the micro so easily. You kind of say, okay, well, we'll do the micro later. Let's just worry about big picture stuff, and it just really helps. It kind of helps everyone focus, because sometimes something will bother them. Something won't be right, like some sort of like production thing that they know in their brain is not right that they want to fix. But then I'm like, well, let's fix it later. We'll watch the movie, after we do this first pass. And if it still bothers you, then we'll go. I try to just encourage to remain as broad stroke as possible, and then kind of like get a little bit more finer tune with each pass through.
Well, it helps you with the continuity of the whole thing too.
Yeah, exactly. It's a little bit more creative that way too, because if you go, hey, you know what, let's do something crazy, or maybe, hey, we did something a little too crazy, let's roll it back. You're not too far down one path. It gives you more flexibility to be a little crazier. It's like, I've always envisioned this scene warm, but let's try it cool and see if we like it better. You can do it pretty quickly and then say, okay, you know what? That was a bad idea. Let's go back to the way it was. And then, without too much cost.
So many of the projects that you've done were completed using Quantel Pablo. So what exactly attracted you to this system, and what sets it apart from other grading systems?
Well, I think when we first were looking at all the DI systems, kind of like around the time of Social Network, I had it before Social Network, but kind of around that time, we really wanted to do everything 4K because we really believed in it and thought that would be like a real new standard. And Pablo is one of the only systems that were kind of offering that kind of horsepower at the time. I really like it. It's really fast. It's really quick. The editing and conform capabilities are really quick. It's always had really great paint cloning tools. Still, like some of the other DI systems don't have quite the power of paint and effects type stuff. So, having a visual effects background, I love that, because I was like, oh, okay, well, if I want to clone out just like a little thing on the ground and then make a clean plate and then track that clean plate in the background, like I can do that. I can do that on this system. And so that was always great. Nowadays, I do use kind of all different systems. I use Resolve. I use Resolve a few times. Really looking at Baselight. There's some really awesome stuff in the new version of Baselight that I think is amazing. I'm trying to stay flexible. I never want to commit too much to one tool set, because it's nice. It's interesting just seeing how the different tool sets approach kind of the same problem. I think it makes you kind of more informed to kind of like have a little bit of an idea of kind of what the other people are doing.
Do you feel like you'll have a different grade depending on what kind of system that you're on, or is it the tool doesn't matter?
I definitely think the tool will inform your process for sure. The way Pablo does an S-curve is similar, but not the exact same thing as like the way Resolve does the S-curve contrast. So it's similar, but it's not exactly the same, or the way the pivot works, or, exactly how different things work. So, I mean, if you're doing like a pure LUT-based workflow, then, it's probably less so. But definitely, like whatever tools are easy, and, like if there's a button that's easy to hit, you're going to hit it. And if it takes you like 3 more steps, then you're just that much less likely to do that thing. Because ultimately our job is about speed. It's about trying to get as much done as we can with the time that we're given. Because you can work on any film for like 500 hours if you're given it, but, obviously not given it. So it's just like however much you can get done. So yeah, definitely. I think things change pretty largely depending on this. I mean, your aesthetic's not going to change. But just the things, how many times you can try something out, or how easily you can get to a certain place, I've definitely kind of influenced.
What's interesting too is that, as you had said, the color grading systems, they have a bunch of, non-color tools these days. Like, You've seen the evolution in the different systems too, where now we have sharpening or noise reduction, warping, clone and paint. So since you have these tools available to you, does it change the way that you'll craft an image?
Yeah, I mean, definitely. I think like that texture is like a huge part of what a colorist brings to the conversation. You know, when a director and a DP are, when they're developing the look, when they're on set and they're lighting and they're talking about the look on set, you know, the texture is, they don't have grain on set in camera or in the dailies, you know. So it's like, that's something that kind of we bring to the table, and our expertise of what works well in what situation and what doesn't work in others is a huge part of it. And, you know, you mentioned glow on that, you know, we did a pretty hefty grain pass. We did a little bit like kind of like a halation, like some kind of like a light diffusion type of things. And then I did another thing where we wanted to feel, Christian said he kind of wanted to feel like a film that had been like filmed out and then like telecine back in, you know? So I kind of like, I did like a very slight blur on the whole picture, and then kind of like did, you know, very small blur on everything. And then like did a sharpen kind of post blur to kind of like, you know, kind of tighten it back up again. So like it felt sharp, but just kind of like stepped on a little bit, you know, like the equivalent of taking it out into the parking lot and like, you know, like rubbing it on the ground, or, you know,
yeah,
taking your jeans or something, you know, and rubbing dirt in.
It went through a couple of VHS generations.
Yeah. I mean, like film generation was like kind of the exact idea. So that's all texture stuff, and it adds a lot to the whole creative look and the whole creative conversation a lot. And that's something that maybe it's totally something like the cinematographer knows, you know, they may know exactly what they want, or they may have some sort of idea and be like, okay, that's my idea. What do you got? You know, what can you do for me? And that's really how we as colorists like create, how we contribute to the whole conversation, you know.
Do you think that part of the grain is like a backlash against how sharp everything has become with digital?
Well, yeah, it's interesting because being part of Panavision, whenever I'm talking to a Panavision coworker, they're like, we can't keep our older lenses in stock. Like they're just flying off the shelf, and all the newer lenses that we're making, they're just less popular. And they contributed to exactly that. Like the cameras are so good and the resolution is so clear now that if you want that look, that's great. But if you don't want that look, then you've gotta do something. So whether it's a vintage lens that just like, you know, it's been dropped, or, you know, it's just not perfect, or it's just some sort of like grain or diffusion or something like that. It's definitely just part of like, maybe backlash is probably a good way of putting it, where it's just, they want some sort of, you know, some sort of like nostalgic feel to it that isn't quite there. And the footage is natural form. You know, it's like, it's interesting because like, just talking about like color science in general, there's always this push to like make colors more accurate. You know, like anytime you do like a camera test nowadays, it's like the footage will come in and be like, okay, well this cloth isn't exactly this color. You know, it's always very much based on like being accurate, and like having like good color is considered very accurate, and this, you know, the reds are exactly red and the greens are separated, and you know, like that's kind of the opposite of like a cinematic color. You know what I mean? So it's like what people want for a accurate color is also kind of what a lot of people say, well, this feels digital, or this feels artificial, or this feels, you know, so it's like, oh, so what you kind of want, you want accurate color, but you also kind of want not accurate color, you know, because all the film stocks, you know, they look different from one another, and that gave a personality. And that was the cinematographer's choice, you know, like they're like, I want Fuji because of these reasons, or I want Kodak for these reasons. It's like, that's another part of our jobs in look management, is like, how can we take accurate color and then mess it up, you know, but mess it up in just the perfect way that works for this film, that doesn't feel digital and kind of like creates more of a kind of a nostalgia to it.
Yeah. And I mean, obviously like Glow was a nostalgic content too, or Stranger Things, or any of those. It's like a lot of those are still like, it's definitely informing how you're going about your workflow.
Yeah. With Glow, I took a film emulation LUT that we use for our film mounts, and then I kind of removed the contrast curve and then put PQ contrast curve back on it. And so I think that's what kind of gave it like a little bit of its film look, and then just kind of, you know, I modified it from there. So it's like, it gave it a little bit of a film look, and it kind of took some of the saturated colors and added density to it, where if it was just like a straight PQ transform, it would have been maybe a little bit too poppy, So it was this kind of mix of old and new that I think makes it really work for that exact show.
Yeah, if you get a group of colors together, there's usually nothing more polarizing than if you're to bring up LUTs. It always has some debate about it, whether is this one accurate? Is this one just for a look? Where did it come from? What is its input taken from? So,
right.
And a LUT can harm your images in some ways too.
Totally, yeah.
But it makes sense that you had a pretty definite idea of how that was going to work for your project. Do you use them generally in other things too?
Well, I build my own LUTs. And so sometimes, like if it's an ARRI show or something like that, I'll take the standard ARRI LUT from the website and I'll have it like kind of to the side. And then maybe I'll build my own based on notes that I'm getting from the cinematographer, references, And so I'll always kind of A/B and be like, okay, is what I'm doing better than kind of the orthodox thing, or is it worse, And so I'll try different things, I'll swing the blues into a little bit more into the cyan, or I'll pull down the reds, I'll do different things, and it'll either be better or worse than kind of like the standard LUT. So it's nice to use LUTs in that way to kind of check yourself. I mean, it's just a table that says this number in, this number out. So it's not bad. It's just another tool. And if you use a LUT that makes your project better, then it's better. I mean, if you're doing something like a film emulation from patches that you filmed out, then the LUT is really the only way that you can do that. You can kind of fake it with curves and things like that. And maybe it's smoother, maybe less colors will break, but you can't really emulate something that's so analog and organic as a film print just with your digital tools, So yeah, I think they're neither good nor bad. They're just a thing, and they either make your project better or they don't. But a lot of the arguments that I see online are really over those like LUTs that are like for sale for like $500 or whatever.
Yeah.
And it's like, that's a lot of money. If I was starting out as a colorist, it might be interesting to look at it and see if I can copy them or something like that. But yeah, I don't think they're good or bad. They're just another tool. And on some films, you really need to use it because it's like, okay, I want a film transform, or I want something else. But then a film look is so subjective, so you could totally make a film look just with curves. And then if it works, it works.
That's a good thing about the LUT too, is it takes all the subjectivity out of it too. It's just, this is the mathematical idea of what a film emulation should be.
Yeah.
And so when you put that in, that's just what it is. So, and you can
Right.
change it if you want to, or you could use it as a jumping off point, but it's just a thing. It just is what it is.
Yeah. But also, like, we're getting content from so many different sources now, so it's like one day it'll be Alexa, next day it'll be Vericam, next day it'll be Red. There's all the little the Black Magic, the like pocket camera, so it's like you have to transform it to something to go into that LUT anyway. So you're still doing color management. It's not like the LUT's replacing color management. You still have to do color management. You still have to match it against other things. Sometimes what I do is like, if I'm starting a film with a cinematographer, they'll come in before they shoot. They'll have some camera test up, like a makeup test. And then maybe I'll make a look if we want like a little bit of a bleach bypass look, or just like a little bit like a, whatever. And then I'll make a LUT that they can load into the camera to shoot with, or have on their DIT station to shoot with. But then ultimately I kind of end up throwing that LUT out when I do the final DI anyway, because I got to make an HDR version now, and I got to make the theatrical, so you're still delivering to different color spaces. So it's like you can use a LUT for like temp for a while, but then ultimately maybe you end up throwing them out, or just using the same LUT but just changing your output. Going back to wherever whether it's in light space or True Light or Lattice or whatever, however you made your LUT, go back into that system and then just changing your output color space. And then it's essentially the same LUT. You're just putting something onto it.
So do you have like a favorite camera, least favorite camera to work on?
The Panavision camera, of course, my current employers. I actually worked on the color science for it. So that was a fun experience, like trying to create a look for a camera that kind of would work for everybody. It's like a look that's specific enough that makes the camera look different and unique, but also kind of generic enough that like everyone will look at it and kind of universally agree that it was good, but also flexible enough that they can kind of imprint their creativity onto it. So that was kind of an interesting challenge, but I know all the cameras are so good these days that it really doesn't matter. It's like you almost, by the end of the film, you're like, what was this shot on? I don't even remember. Because it's like cameras don't really have, for me anyway, I don't feel like cameras don't really have looks. They're just really big light meters that give you data, and then you can, you bring in that data, you creatively manipulate it, and then you output it to a display. You get resolution out of it, and you get signal to noise ratio out of it, and these things, but they're all so good right now. It's like whichever camera's better to work with is really the one that you should go for.
Obviously, anything that shoots RAW or is a preferred camera.
Yeah. I mean, all the top camera, and again, like the Panavision camera is my current employer, but all the top, the Sony, the Arri, the Red, they're all, and the Bearcam, they're all great. And even if it's just the log ProRes, I mean, you can get a great image out of it. I wouldn't recommend mastering for HDR if you're just working off of a 10-bit log, but it's not preferred, but it still looks, pretty good.
So if you were starting as a colorist today, what advice would you give yourself?
I think it's like a lot of starting out colorists, they do like a lot of, like when you're learning, I think, you're like, okay, I can do this. I can add contrast, and then I'll add a node, and then I'll put blue in the blacks, and then I'll add a node, and then I'll warm up the blacks. And then I'll, you kind of fight yourself a little bit, kind of naturally, kind of when you're learning, and you end up with 100 layers and you go a little big. I think it's like being a colorist is more like, it's more just like seasoning, you know what I mean? Like the cinematographer is delivering you this like amazing piece of meat, like this amazing steak. And all you got to do is just not screw it up. You just gotta like sear it a little bit and then put some salt, and it's perfect. It's like you just want to bring out the flavor that's there and not ruin it by over seasoning it, And so it's really easy to over season some footage. I think it takes some experience to like really recognize like what's great about this footage, like what's great about it, and what can I do to really bring out what's great about it. And that comes with experience. But, you're not the star. The footage is the star, and you just want to make the footage be the best that it can. And, really it's just not making it worse. It's such an odd answer, I guess, but it's like, it's just really just bringing out whatever is really in that footage and making it the best, just removing, it's like sculpting where you're just, like a sculptor just kind of removes the pieces of marble that are not the sculpture. They just remove what's not needed. And then just the only thing that's left is kind of what's so great about the footage in the first place.
Yeah. I mean, I always think of it like graphic design or logo design. It's like some of the stuff is so simple, but to make something very simple is actually very hard.
Yeah. I mean, that's great design, right? Like great design is something that seems so obvious, right? It seems like, oh, of course, it's just this, but it's so hard to do that. It's like, and more complicated design is almost always the worst design. It's the simple, perfect, simple. It does exactly what it needs to do. And your intended audience gets exactly what they need. They get that emotional impact. I mean, I think that's another thing that's like, people say it's always about the story, but I think, taking that one step further is like, it's always about the story, but really it's always about the emotional impact, because like the audience doesn't walk away always remembering every single fact about the story and like the sequence of events. But what they walk away with was that feeling that they had when they connected with the story, And so it's like, that's, as colorists, that's what we get to do, is we get to like really make that feeling, so much more impactful. So it's really about that. Just like, how can we make it more impactful?
Yes, absolutely. Well, it's been really good talking with you, Ian.
Awesome.
Thank you so much for coming on the podcast. So if somebody wants to learn more about you or get in contact with you, where can they find you?
Geez, I am not like on any of the social medias or anything like that. I guess, I mean, I'm on like Facebook and stuff like that. You can just, see me, Ian Vertovec, in the Light Iron website and stuff like that. But yeah, no, I'm not really on the Twitters or anything of those sorts.
You work in the shadows.
Yeah.
Well, cool. Thanks a lot for coming on.
All right. Thank you so much, Josh.
Thanks.